a few more people to join us, I think, but I'm thrilled that everybody's able to be part of this discussion. Thanks so much to our panelists for joining us today. I'm based in Toronto, and it's a beautiful, blue, sunny day, one that takes our mind off our current predicament in COVID, which I know is creating a lot of frustration. And at the same time, we are concentrating on what's going on overseas and how connected Canada is to those problems. So that's what we'll be dealing with today. Hello, my name is Robert Baines, and I am President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable NGO dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. We're helping to go host this event today with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. We're thrilled to partner today on that. Thoughts about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization do not usually occur to Canadians on a daily basis, but the peace, prosperity, and security that NATO provides are integral to our way of life. The principle that an attack upon one is an attack upon all is the foundation of NATO and maintains peace through strength, perhaps the greatest lesson of the death and destruction of the Second World War. This collective defense draws its strength through unity, and the correlation is, of course, that division is its main weakness. This makes the current situation with Russia on the borders of Ukraine a challenge to NATO, and one that we'll discuss today, and an important consideration for Canada's policy towards this issue. We hope that you'll join us and continue to engage with the NATO Association, in addition to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Continue this conversation. Join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter, and encourage you to subscribe to both of our YouTube channels as well, so that you can be part of future events. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today, Zachary Pakin. Zach's a non-resident research fellow with the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, and is going to be taking us through this discussion and introducing the rest of the panel. Zach.
Thank you so much, Robert, and it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you very much to the NATO Association of Canada for sponsoring this very timely discussion with us today. And we are grateful to have with us, as you just mentioned, Rob, 4 fantastic panelists, three of whom are based in Canada, and one of whom will be joining us from overseas. So joining us today, we have Anatol Lieven from England, who is a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft on Russian and European affairs. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anatol.
Hello.
Paul Robinson is Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, as well as a senior fellow with us here at IPD. And I assume you're joining us from Ottawa today, Paul, is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, glad to be here.
Wonderful to see you again. Alexander Wanoshka is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the University of Waterloo, where I presume you are stationed this morning.
I'm, as a matter of fact, in Windsor, Ontario, where I live, but Waterloo is where I work in normal times. But thank you very much.
Normal times. Great to see you. And last but certainly not least, Yulia Ivanyuk is the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba, and I presume you are joining us from Winnipeg today.
That's right, and thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here today.
That's great. Wonderful to see you. So we'd like to start off with Anatol this morning, or this afternoon in your case. Anatol, please guide us through this week's events. We've seen a flurry of diplomatic activity, an extraordinary session of the US-Russia Strategic Stability Dialogue, as well as the meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, and a summit of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Where do things stand right now between Russia and the West after this week's events?
Well, they began, of course, with Russian military deployments close to the border with Ukraine, though these don't seem to be at a level that would allow an actual invasion yet. This was followed by Russian demands. We can't really be sure whether these were categorical or whether they were just initial bargaining counters, but that NATO should rule out further expansion to countries on Russia's borders, and should also rule out further deployments of NATO arms and equipment to new NATO members. The first was automatically rejected by the United States and later by NATO as a whole. On the second, there have been certain but very vague indications from the Biden administration of a possible willingness to compromise, of course, in return for Russian concessions on the other side. There also appeared to be hints of possibly a fresh American commitment to the Minsk II agreement for autonomy for the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, the separatist area of eastern Ukraine backed by Russia. But we haven't heard anything more on that, either from America or European countries. And statements from Russia seem to indicate that Russia regards this pretty much as categorical rejection of its positions by the US and NATO. And so we are now basically waiting to see what Russia does next, and if there can be any fresh offer or suggestion from Washington or from Europe that would allow negotiations to move forward.
Thanks very much for that overview, Anatol. Alexander, over to you next. More than 30 years ago, we were talking about a Europe whole and free, and yet now there's the possibility that we could be seeing interstate war in Europe. So how did we get from there to here?
Well, I think we have seen from Russia aggression towards Ukraine, quite frankly. I think, though, there has been a buildup of Russian military forces near Ukraine's border that might not necessarily be capable of an invasion, although I'm not entirely sure what that means, but certainly capable of engaging in, at very least, punitive strikes against Ukrainian military assets. I think we're here precisely because on Russia's side, there is this growing awareness that Ukraine is sovereign, it's acting more and more independently, is integrating more and more with Euro-Atlantic institutions, so much so that its influence on that country has been waning. And since 2014, in fact, we have been seeing more and more interest on the part of Ukrainians to join NATO and other Euro-Atlantic institutions. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is a growing frustration on the part of the Russian leadership that Ukraine appears unwilling to negotiate. I think there was some optimism early on when Zelensky was president that he'd be much more open to dialogue. But what we've seen in the last 2 years is frustration on Ukraine's side that any sort of openness towards dialogue or making any sort of concessions have not been reciprocated. And so Zelensky has more or less doubled down on some aspects of his own predecessor's policies. So I interpret the military buildup on Ukraine's border as a sign of Russian weakness, as a matter of fact, that because it is unable to exercise non-military means of influence upon that country, it resorts to this sort of heavy metal diplomacy in order to compel Ukraine to accept terms that are much more favorable to Moscow than not. So, you know, as Hannah Arendt would say, the definition of power is to work in concert with others. When you resort to violence, that's the absence of power. I think that's actually what's going on here, and the situation is very much concerning. We are seeing movements from the Eastern Military District today. There has been a cyber attack targeting Ukrainian government websites. I'm not sure what this is a prelude for, but it's very serious, and I think the threat is very credible.
Paul, do you agree with that take? Are we on the verge of war right now in Europe because of Russian weakness and Russia's fear of losing Ukraine?
I think the sort of talk of Russian invasion coming out of the blue, without any provocation or whatever, I think it is rather overblown. Certainly there's no signs of the Russian government, Russian state preparing public opinion for that. Certainly if you watch the Russian TV at the moment, they're not gearing up the population for war. Furthermore, I mean, we see some signals such as Dmitry Medvedev's recent article in which he said the best policy for Russia towards Ukraine was to do nothing. And, when you have someone like Medvedev saying that, it's not indicative of a sudden desire to launch a war out of nowhere. At the same time, though, we have seen a number of statements from Putin, General Gerasimov, and others saying that should Ukraine seek to reestablish control of Donbass by force, the Russians would respond. In Putin's case, he said, this would be the end of Ukrainian statehood. There is, I think you can view this as to some degree being an act of deterrence to send a very strong warning to Ukraine not to try and do what the Azeris, of course, recently did with their lost territories against Armenia, and as Saakashvili tried to do in 2008 with South Ossetia. So there are, I think, strong indications that the Russians have given up really on the Ukrainian government. They think the Ukrainian government is incapable of striking a deal to give Donbass any sort of autonomy, which is the bare minimum really required for peaceful reintegration of Donbass into Ukraine. And they have seen sort of other indications, such as the recent purchase of drones from Turkey and so on, the arrest of Viktor Medvedchuk, the closing down of opposition TV stations, the impending arrest of Petro Poroshenko, which is going to happen when he returns to the country in a few days' time, and the closing down of his TV stations, all of which would sort of indicate that power in Ukraine has shifted into the hands of what in Russia you call the Siloviki, the security apparatus. This is causing concern in Moscow, and they are taking preparatory measures just in case. But I don't think you should look at it much further beyond that, personally.
Yulia, I'm wondering if you can help us understand what that implies, just picking up on Paul's most recent comments about the fact that we have seen in recent months some abuses in Ukraine of what we in the West would consider to be fundamental norms, values, or principles in terms of freedom of the media, in terms of not prosecuting your democratic rivals. Is this really a clear-cut black and white situation in Ukraine right now? How should we be viewing it in terms of good versus evil, as people like to say?
It certainly has not been without challenges in the Ukrainian armed forces, law enforcement, military procurement, judicial reforms are underway. But on the one hand, significant progress has made. On the other hand, we can see that a lot could still be achieved. But I would like to reiterate that Ukraine has shown its commitment to pacifism, first of all, by agreeing to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Buildup Memorandum, which, by the way, assured inviolability of Ukraine's borders. Then invasion of Ukraine happens in Crimea, and later the unrest in Ukraine's eastern parts. In 2010, Ukraine adopted non-alignment status and continued defunding its armed forces, specifically to appease Russia. And then Maidan take place, where Ukrainian people express their desire to associate closer with the EU. And it's quite interesting that at that time, NATO support in Ukraine was close to 14%. And we see where it got Ukraine. And that for Russia, not only the question of NATO, but also a question of the EU is a zero-sum game. As a result, today we have 58% of Ukrainians supporting Ukraine's joining NATO, and of course, interest in other countries such as Sweden and Finland in particular is growing. But on the other hand, I shall also add that the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO is not as real. Unfortunately, it is not as real as imminent as Russia might want us to think, despite the fact that 58% of Ukrainians would like to join NATO. We can see that even before the escalation that took place this year, NATO member states were extremely cautious about even discussing an action membership plan for Ukraine. So there are a lot of political and other factors to factor in this issue.
But what I'm hoping to help you, if you wouldn't mind, Yulia, again, just helping us unpack a little bit, is it not difficult to a certain extent for NATO on the one hand to claim that it is a community of values, that it is trying to uphold existing norms and principles in the European security system and in the European civilization, as it were, to a certain extent even, while at the same time there are some of its own members, as well as key partners like Ukraine, who are not always necessarily upholding those norms and values at every instance? Does that not lead, by definition, to a worsening of the security situation with Russia, because it allows Moscow to point out that there are Western double standards effectively in the practice of its foreign policy?
Well, I would argue that Ukraine is upholding Western values and is moving towards becoming a liberal democracy and is actively trying to reform itself. And in particular, due to support from Canada and in particular Mission Unifier, we've seen a tremendous amount of reform that happened in Ukraine's security services and in the armed forces. Of course, there are some other reforms, in particular judicial, that is underway and is needed. But it is also clear that the issue of Ukraine and the broader Eastern and Central European flank of NATO cannot be separated or compartmentalized as many of us in the West probably would like. This is a discussion of the rules-based order and consistency of international law. And unfortunately, Russia has been a major violator of international law. And therefore, Ukraine needs Western assistance and Canada's assistance as well.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. Anatol, over to you. First of all, if you'd like to respond to anything that's been said so far, feel free. But I was wondering if you could also help our audience to understand a little bit about how we should think about the Ukrainian conflict, because it appears that there are two dimensions. There's the intra-Ukrainian civil war, and then there's also the interstate dimension of Russia's foreign policy goals vis-a-vis Ukraine. So how should we primarily be viewing this conflict? Is this primarily an intra-Ukrainian conflict with external powers intervening in this, or is this primarily an instance of Russian aggression against Ukraine?
Well, I think it's both, obviously. I mean, and that has very much been the pattern of international history since the Second World War. There have been relatively few clear-cut wars between states like Iran, Iraq. Far more of them have been outside states, involving themselves in the internal problems or civil wars of states, which I think is what happened in eastern Ukraine. Crimea was rather different. I mean, on the broader front, look, I think we have to start from a standpoint of reality. Ukraine is not going to join NATO, and the reason for that is that as Biden and all other NATO leaders have made absolutely clear, NATO is not going to fight to defend Ukraine. In other words, an Article 5 guarantee would be empty in this case and would be an invitation to crushing humiliation for NATO. European countries are not building up their armed forces in a way that would be remotely adequate to take on the defense of Ukraine against Russia. And of course, nor is America redeploying troops to Europe in the way that would be necessary. So there is a degree of falsity about NATO's position here. But of course, I mean, as we've seen, America, this is something that has alarmed Russia, obviously, has been arming Ukraine to a degree for the defense of Ukraine. As for the European Union, once again, one must face reality. After our, shall we say, not altogether happy experiences, and I speak here as, well, I'm a Brit, so we're no longer in the European Union, alas, but anyway. But our unhappy experiences with Britain, and still more, of course, with Poland, with Hungary, with Romania, with Bulgaria, and the very widespread failure of reform and liberal democracy there is no appetite, and I stress no appetite, in Western Europe or Brussels for enlargement to take in Ukraine. So this is... Ukraine is to a considerable degree stuck. Now, when it comes to Ukrainian internal policies and politics, I think the key issue, certainly the key issue as regards the Donbass, but also as regards Russian attitudes, has been Ukrainian government moves, which have very much intensified over the past year, towards Ukrainianization, in other words, towards a purely ethno-linguistic version of Ukrainian nationalism, with very strong moves against the Russian language in Ukraine, echoing in many ways what was done in the Baltic states in that regard. Insofar as Russia, pretty much it must be said, like, other states in this situation, it does regard itself as having a deep stake in the position of the Russian minority in Ukraine and its cultural and linguistic status, and also, of course, regards this as a mainstay of the enduring relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, this has really, stirred up hostility and alarm in Moscow. It's also, of course, completely contrary to the principles that the West has said or claimed that it has, been defending elsewhere in the world and maintaining at home in terms of, multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, and so on. Of course, in addition, the whole, the Donbass issue, as Paul, I think, has said, can only be resolved on the basis of autonomy. And certainly these moves towards Ukrainianization within Ukraine have made it, I would say, simply impossible that the majority of the population in the Donbass or Crimea would agree to return to Ukraine without full guarantee of such autonomy, even if they were given the chance. So, but of course, as long as the Donbass conflict remains open, it is also impossible for Ukraine to join NATO, because that would imply NATO involving itself in a war over disputed territory with Russia. I don't think you'll find any appetite whatsoever in NATO for that. So this is where we are.
Alexander, you have your hand up and you want to jump in, but I'll also guide the discussion to a certain extent, if you don't mind.
Actually, Yulia had her hand up before me.
Yulia had her hand up first. Okay, so I'll throw out this question to both of you, and you can also respond to what's already been said. But one of the things that Anatol just brought up was the notion that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO or the European Union are slim to none. And therefore, this discussion that we often have concerning Ukraine has to do with the principle, so-called, of Ukraine's right to choose, right? That it has a right to choose a Western orientation. But at the end of the day, they're not going to be joining NATO. They're not going to be joining the European Union. So should we indeed be risking war with Russia for the principle that Ukraine has the right to choose, even if it is not going to be able to make that choice anyways? Yulia, if you'd like to jump in first, and then over to Alexander.
Thank you. I just wanted to provide my argument. In Russia's eyes, Russian language equals Russian culture and therefore equals Russian nation, Russian identity. And this principle has been employed numerous times on the post-Soviet space. And so if people speak, if the majority of the population in certain country or certain region of the country speaks Russian, therefore they need Russian help, even if they are not asking for this help. In fact, 50% of population of Ukrainians speak Russian as their first language, but sees themselves as Ukrainian. There has been numerous research in Ukrainian done in particular on interregional cooperation. Some of it shows that more of that joint communities could have been built interregionally, but at the same time that language is not one of the main contentious issues in Ukraine. It's more the economic disparity between the different classes. And also I would like to add that Russian is the language of fighting on both sides, on the Russian proxy and Russian armed forces and on the Ukrainian armed forces side. So this is just my short intervention, and I'll let other speakers contribute as well.
Sounds good. And Alexander, you had your hand up as well. And could you weigh in on this question of
Sure,
principles? I mean, how realistic are these principles that the West has today?
I don't think you need to invoke Ukraine's territorial conflict with Russia or the democratic credentials of Hungary and Poland to argue that NATO membership to Kyiv will not be extended. After all, in 2008, when these factors were not all present, in fact, Poland and Hungary were seen still as exemplars of liberal democracy in Central Europe, and Ukraine had tense, but definitely not bellicose relations with Russia. NATO had decided not to extend membership action plan. And so that raises the question, if NATO membership is not practically in the cards, then why not just make that symbolic declaration to this effect? Why is NATO so hesitant to do so? Well, the answer is that, well, for one, you don't want to make such a symbolic declaration with a gun to your partner's head. No one wants to give in to coercion or compellence in that way. For another, such a declaration would run afoul of Article 10 of the Washington Treaty. In effect, what Russia has been asking has been NATO to essentially rewrite its own founding treaty, whereby it is stated that any aspiring country can join the alliance so long as it has the unanimous consent of all parties. And indeed, for that reason, Ukraine is not able to join NATO. It works both in favor for Ukraine and against Ukraine that Article 10 of the Washington Treaty exists. And so I think this issue could be turned on its head in the sense that if we know that practically NATO membership is not going to be extended to Ukraine, that really, there's this symbolic commitment that's on the table, then one has to ask the question, is really a symbolic commitment on the part of NATO what is, or the need for that is what driving Russia to build up, according to one estimate, 51 to 52 battalion tactical groups near Ukraine's border, shifting resources around the country in preparation for a potential military attack? I think not. I think the whole issue of NATO membership with regards to Ukraine is a red herring. I think other factors are more prominent here.
Okay, Alexander, but there is the notion not just of Ukraine and NATO, but the issue of NATO in Ukraine. Does Russia have a right to be concerned about NATO's military contributions to Ukraine or potential NATO military presence of some sort in Ukraine? Is that a legitimate security concern? I think
those concerns are overstated. We have to keep stock of what is actually being provided to Ukraine. So Canada only has 200 military personnel in that country, and they're scattered around the country offering advice, and they've been training military personnel. The British and the Americans also have a presence there, but really they're headquartered in the western part of the country, very far away from the front line. Most NATO members don't actually give any military assistance to Ukraine. Only a large majority of them do, and those that do tend to give secondhand equipment to the extent that it is lethal. We're talking about pistols and rifles as what Canada has been giving. Yes, there are javelins that the United States has been sending, but even those packages of javelins are much smaller than what the United States has been giving to neighboring, or not neighboring, but nearby Lithuania, which is a country a tenth the size, but still gets more or less the same package, if not even greater. So I think there is this tendency to overstate the sorts of military assistance that Western countries is giving. I think at best you can interpret that military assistance as signaling a very partial commitment. But even so, Biden had ruled out unilateral military action. The Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom has also ruled out NATO's direct involvement in any sort of hostilities or increase in hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. So really, objectively speaking, I don't think there's much there. Of course, if there's a perception in Moscow that this military assistance is as big as it is, or as big as it claims it is, that could be another story. But I think that raises the question as to whether there's just other factors really at play here.
So Paul, you've got your hand up, and I'm wondering if you could also pick up on what Alex just said, which is that Western military assistance to Ukraine has been quite limited, but at the same time, Western pronouncements vis-a-vis Russia have been to a certain extent quite strong. So does this not represent the worst of both worlds, that the West has been willing to turn up the temperature and escalate the conflict with Russia without actually doing what's necessary to provide Ukraine and other European states with the tools they need actually to defend themselves?
Well, yes, as has often been said, the West is prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian, and certainly not to fight itself. Responding to Alexander, I think, if you're sitting in Moscow, things look very different. Because, with all due respect to our co-hosts from the, Canada NATO Association, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately as a former soldier, NATO soldier myself, NATO in the past 2 decades has twice attacked sovereign countries who pose no threat to NATO whatsoever. Other NATO members outside of NATO have also engaged in extremely hostile acts, including invasions of countries such as Iraq. So if you're sitting in Moscow, the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance about which you do not need to worry makes no sense whatsoever. You know, people would simply laugh at that. And when you have, say, you know, John Kerry coming on after the annexation of Crimea and saying that Russia must understand that you can't invade countries on made-up pretexts, you know, they laugh, frankly. So it's very important in international relations to be able to understand how things view from the other side's point of view, and I don't think we're very good at that. And beyond that, I think you know, although you may be technically NATO can't you know violate its own charter by NATO ruling out membership for somebody, but individual members can rule it out. There's no reason why Canada, for instance, cannot say we will not support Ukrainian membership of NATO, or the United States cannot say that, because however much a nation has a right to apply, we have no obligation to accept. Right? We should only accept if it is in our national interest to do so. But I cannot see what national interest would be served by us supporting Ukrainian membership of NATO. I mean, it wouldn't strengthen the security of Canada in any way, shape, or form, as far as I can see. I'd also like to make one more point, which goes on from what Anatol said about autonomy for Donbass, and that this is an essential part of any peace deal. I think this is absolutely essential to understand. It is impossible for Donbass to be peacefully reintegrated into Ukraine without substantial autonomy and an amnesty. The Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics have established functioning states, maybe not very well functioning states, but functioning state structures. They have tens of thousands of civil servants and everything else. They have an army of 30, 40,000 people with tanks, heavy artillery, all the rest of it. They're not just going to surrender, right, for nothing. I mean, let's just be practical about this. And even if people say, well, you know, it's unjust or whatever, the practical reality is that these little statelets exist, they have armies, and there is simply no way they're just going to surrender themselves to the mercies of the Ukrainian state without getting something extremely substantial in return. And there is no way that the Russian government could sell any peace deal to the Russian people without such autonomy and amnesty. Therefore, that is the bare minimum of any peaceful reintegration of Donbass. And that's basically what's in the Minsk agreements. But the Ukrainian government has persistently turned this down. As a result, the Ukrainian government is itself the major stumbling block on the reintegration of Donbass into Ukraine. And unless the Ukrainian government changes that position, we will have no settlement. And this will continue to be a thorn in the international relations and a cause of potential war. And it's important that we in the West actually make this clear to the Ukrainians. And unfortunately, we have over the years failed to use our leverage, which we have over the Ukrainians, to force them to move on this. Now, if we're not prepared to do that, and I think sadly, I think even if we were prepared to do that now, I fear that the Ukrainian state is not in a position actually anymore to carry it out. Then at the very bare minimum, we should be looking to bring some sort of permanent peace by freezing the conflict, having a genuine ceasefire, some international peacekeeping force in place to separate the two parties. And then at least the shooting will stop. And once the shooting stops, then all this danger of escalation into major war will pass. It will still be a diplomatic problem, but it will no longer be a military problem. But again, that's something the Ukrainian government doesn't like to accept, because it's actually kind of suits it to have a low-going war, because a low-level war doesn't cost much, but it keeps Ukraine in the attention of Western states and therefore guarantees Ukraine Western support. Okay, but we encourage this, sadly, okay, rather than using our leverage to make the Ukrainians settle. And I think, therefore, we need to have a really major rethink about our policy towards Ukraine.
So everyone else has their hand up now, which is fantastic. Paul, though, I just want to push back before I turn over the floor to everyone else. there is the argument, of course, that the Minsk agreements were imposed on Ukraine at the barrel of a gun. You know,
well, yeah, they were. That's absolutely true. But that doesn't alter the fact that that's the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that these little statelets exist. They have a large army. They have the backing of a major power. And there is simply no way that they can be peacefully reintegrated other than by autonomy and amnesty. If you have an idea of how they could be peacefully integrated otherwise, I'd be love to hear it, because I cannot imagine what it would be.
Okay, Anatol had his hand up first, so let's go to Anatol first, and then we'll give Yulia and then Alexander the chance to respond.
Just to endorse very strongly what Paul said, and of course, every peace agreement through compromise to end a conflict is by definition at the point of a gun. That's why you need a peace agreement, right? But the West, remember, this agreement was brokered by the French and Germans and endorsed by the United States and the United Nations. So this is actually our position. Minsk too, and autonomy for the Donbass. The problem is, getting it implemented. Just a couple of things, other things, very briefly. On countries having an interest in what they regard as their co-ethnic minorities beyond their borders, perhaps I might be forgiven for recalling a phrase of President de Gaulle's that Canadians might remember: "Vive le Québec libre." This is, not confined to the Russians. Finally, I have a recommendation for how Canada could really develop, strong emotional sympathy and identification with Ukraine in its present position. I suggest that Canada leaves NATO and applies to join a military alliance with China and see what happens to it at the hands of its rather larger neighbor. So much for the rules-based order, by the way.
Well, right. I mean, that may not be a realistic scenario, but perhaps Russian troops in Venezuela or Cuba, as has been mentioned recently, might be a more realistic scenario. And indeed, that's not something that the United States would ever accept, given that the Monroe Doctrine remains the Monroe Doctrine.
But Ottawa would not even accept that.
So let's go to Yulia first and then Alexander.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that first and foremost, Ukraine has adopted law on special status in the Donbass and Luhansk areas. And on the other hand, Russia has not allowed for OSCE monitoring, has not withdrawn heavy equipment, it's not allowed for humanitarian assistance to be provided to the proxy-controlled territories. And Russia is the country that, first and foremost, supported, armed, and masterminded the unrest in Ukraine's eastern territories. No conflict existed there prior to Russian belligerent actions. Russia right now insists on elections being carried out in that area before the troops are withdrawn. And of course, for Ukraine, that would be fatal for Ukraine's statehood. So we can see that Russia is interested in this new Russia Novorossiya project, which implies federalization and in many ways decentralization, where each region of Ukraine should get an autonomy and their own constitutions, as well as veto power as far as questions of international or defense importance are concerned, that they are trying to impose during the Minsk talks. And clearly they're trying to go back to the 18th century buffer zone, Novorossiya, becoming Eastern Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine cannot agree to having elections held while the Russian troops are still remaining to be on the territory of the occupied Donbass and Luhansk.
So what about the Steinmeier formula then? Is that completely dead at this point?
I believe that it certainly needs to be revisited, and while the Minsk, some of the Minsk format might be preserved, but the particular terms and conditions need to be revisited, and there's no way why other countries could not join the Normandy format when it comes to mediation. And in particular, I personally would like to see Canada more involved in peaceful negotiations and mediation among the parties. But once again, first of all, also Russia has to admit being party to the state, party to the conflict, which they initially they were participating in negotiations and sending their personnel to represent Russia's interests. Now they are insisting that they're not party to conflict. So that's where the question of, does Russia want a resolution of the Donetsk crisis arise?
Okay, so we'll get to the question of Canada in just one moment, but first let's give Alexander the chance to respond that everything's been said. Then we've got a question from the audience for Anatol, and then after that we'll shift over to Canada.
Sure. I'll just reiterate what Yulia had just said. I think we have to go back and rewind the tape a little bit, because in 2014, when the agitations first started in the Donbass region, Ukraine was on the back foot and really struggled at first, but then was able to take the fight to those insurgents rather successfully and rather effectively. What had happened, of course, is that seeing that the insurgents in eastern Ukraine were on the losing side, that was when we saw Russia step up its humanitarian assistance and thereby provide heavy military equipment. And so then you see Ukrainian armed forces really take a stumble. And so they had to eventually, of course, sign on to the Minsk agreement. Because it's one thing, as Yatsenyuk had said at the time, to fight a scrappy group of rebels. It's another thing to fight a group of rebels backed by a nuclear armed power. And indeed, this raises a question, because you said earlier, is this a civil war or not? Well, it's a civil conflict at minimum, sure. But the only reason why there's a war going on is really because of Russia's participation. After all, insurgency is a collective action problem. It's incredibly risky, incredibly costly. And for people to be willing participants in it, as they are in Eastern Ukraine, you have to have certain incentives, you have to have certain capabilities. And really, some surveys done really indicate very little support for aspects of the Russian project. Yulia mentioned Novorossiya. Sure, there's about 20–30%, but really that's the ceiling. So really, I think the stumbling block is not Ukraine, because I don't think a low intensity conflict is in its interest. It's just an outcome of Russia's participation in it. I think Russia needs to be much more open about its own involvement in that conflict. And I think Russia has been very disingenuous, even this past week, in its participation. So it's very hard to negotiate with Russia when it simply denies basic facts and acts, quite frankly, in bad faith.
Anatol, a question from Charles Knight in the audience for you, which is, should we not at this point in the negotiation process, should we not be seeing both sides actually revealing to a certain extent the content of what has been discussed and actually make statements based on that fact, rather than continuing to parrot their existing points to their own respective domestic audiences? I mean, basically the question amounts to, how much longer should we expect the sides to continue talking past each other? And I suppose I should ask a follow-up, which is, how long can they continue to talk past each other without there being, very serious and grave consequences? And I suppose just a corollary, because or a follow-up question on this front as well, because we do need to move on to Canada, but which is, how should we understand the source of tension right now between Russia and the West? Is it largely to do with the situation in Ukraine, or are there broader issues of European security here that would be more useful to address first as a means of dealing with the situation in Ukraine? Which has to come first?
Well, on the second point, I'm afraid Ukraine has to come first. I wish it didn't, because it is, of course, the most intractable of all the issues. But I don't see how you can create a new security architectural relationship in Europe without reaching some kind of agreement concerning Ukraine. On the first point, well, yes, I entirely agree. It would be enormously helpful if we could really assess what the two sides are actually saying, because then, we would be able to assess, independently, just how sincere they are, in their alleged, willingness to compromise and negotiate. But of course, that's not generally how diplomacy works. Just to reply to a couple of points that have been made, including questions from the audience. Of course, I don't deny for a second Russian troops under light disguise, are heavily involved in the Donbass, and any peace settlement has to involve their withdrawal and some kind of international peacekeeping force. But to reiterate, it's not enough, as Ukraine has done, to half promise provisional temporary autonomy for the Donbass. This has to be permanent and full autonomy. But of course, it doesn't come into force until peace agreement and the withdrawal of troops. As to the exact sequence, and how when precisely elections are to be held, with a modicum of goodwill on both sides, I think we could get agreement on that. But demilitarization is essential, and guaranteed permanent full autonomy is essential.
Okay, we've got half an hour left, everyone, so we will be finishing at 1:15 noon. So everyone, please do stick with us. I'm going to use this last half an hour to talk a little bit about what Canada's interests are in this context. So Paul, I'm going to turn to you first. If you could help our audience understand, Russia may indeed pose a significant security threat to certain NATO members and to Ukraine, but does it pose a security threat to Canada? And what are Canada's distinct interests as it relates to its relations with Russia and as it relates to the shape of the European security architecture?
Well, clearly, I mean, Russia doesn't pose a direct threat to Canada in the sense that Russian troops are not going to be landing on our shores, not now or in my lifetime or lifetime of anybody at this session. But that's simply not going to happen. The danger, I think, really, as far as the Canadian interest in this is we really don't want to see a war between Russia and Ukraine, which has massive international implications, which leads to a complete severing of relations between Russia and the West, which obliges us to sort of permanently go back to the Cold War period, where we had troops stationed at La and so on. I mean, we don't want that. So it is in our interest to see this conflict in Ukraine settled. I wouldn't. It's not a vital national interest, right? Canada is not going to live or die because of this. It's a very secondary interest, and I think the sort of amount of resources we've put into it reflects that, right? I mean, it's not like we're putting a vast major effort into this, because we're not. However, I do think that. Some of the sort of kind of talk which surrounds it to do with this is a struggle of democracy against authoritarianism and blah 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 is deeply overblown. The democracy in the West is not going to stand and fall on what happens in Ukraine and things like that. So it is a very secondary issue for us, but it's one in which we do have some interest, I would say.
Yulia, we have a question from the audience from Lauren Hogan, and I'm going to direct it to you, which is that Canada is home to the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world, other than Russia. And therefore, does that not constitute for Canada a significant national interest that we need to take into account when dealing with the situation in Ukraine? And if you don't mind, I'm going to add a follow-up to that, which is, if it is indeed a significant national interest to us, then is there not a risk that in our involvement in the Ukrainian conflict, we're going to be talking more to ourselves rather than talking to the world? Is this not part and parcel with the fact that many politicians in Ottawa and many governments are very happy cynically to exploit certain conflicts around the world for domestic partisan political gain, and therefore we don't actually pursue an objective consideration of the Canadian national interest, but are rather talking to various ethnocultural groups in Canada instead?
Well, I think that Russia's strategy goes well beyond Ukraine, and therefore, for Canada, it's important to show resolve to Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. because if it's not done, then Putin will continue challenging NATO countries, in particular, we know those that joined after 1997, and non-NATO neighbors are in especially vulnerable position. And security fabric of Europe significantly affects the international balance and therefore affects Canada. And Ukraine is, we should admit, Ukraine is a dampener of Russia's global ambitions. And if the West and Canada in particular sends Russia the signal and allows them to continue behaving the way that they are behaving belligerently towards Ukraine, it only empowers them to also expand their global ambitions. And also, like, who knows if it will not start affecting Arctic and also other significant areas that are important to Canada.
Yes, but Yulia, my question was about Canadian domestic politics. I mean, how much should Canadian foreign policy be based on domestic considerations, on the composition of our population, for example?
I think since Ukraine has such close cross-cultural and including diaspora ties to Canada, of course, this fact by itself does impact Canada's foreign policy. But on the other hand, also, we should not discount that there are other important ties. For example, in 2017, a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement was signed between Ukraine and Canada, and Ukraine has the largest and fastest growing number of IT professionals in Europe. And Canada outsources a lot of its needs to Ukraine. And also, I believe that international engagement is an important contribution to Canada's own security and also reinforcement of Canada's mid-power status. And in particular, in terms of supporting and advancing liberal democracies and rule of law, which are the values that Canada stands by. So in this way, I believe that broader security in Europe is of extreme importance to Canada. And on a less positive note, we have seen that democratization and reformation progress in transitionary societies like Ukraine are not always irreversible. And especially in face of military aggression, it's important for Canada to continue supporting Ukraine in terms of democracy building initiatives and also continuation of the Operation Unifier. And I guess just one more short note, Ukraine and in particular, Ukraine and Canadian Armed Forces cooperation is a two-sided engagement. So Canadian Armed Forces members get to learn about Russia and hybrid warfare. They get to test their interoperability and also empower their staff. And we see this special relationship bring about benefits to Canada, even in unexpected places, such as Ukrainian special forces helping evacuate Afghani translators and their families to Canada. So there's a lot to be gained from such increased cooperation and Canada's involvement in Ukraine outside of the strictly cultural aspects.
Okay, I'm going to go to Alexander next, and then Anatol, I know you have to leave at the top of the hour, so I'll let you have some concluding thoughts at that point. Alexander.
Yeah, so again, I would reiterate what Yulia would say. I would also just add that I think it's a little dangerous to suggest that ethnic groups might be distorting Canadian foreign policy in a way that bends it away from the national interest. Indeed, as much as the Ukrainian diaspora community is large, as already stated, I think we can identify other reasons for why Canada has the sorts of policies that it does. I mean, after all, it is a maritime democracy to some extent. It depends on a functioning international order based on openness and free trade, not least because it relies so much on trade with the United States. But even so, the United Kingdom and the European Union are two of its major trading partners. In fact, I think they're in the top 5. And so it's very keen on there being overseas stability, it values the territorial order, and more to the point, it values the upholding of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Accords, whereby European leaders cannot adjust boundaries by use of external force. So as much as Canada might not have vital national interests at stake here, as Paul had mentioned, it still has important enough reasons to care about this particular crisis. And of course, that says nothing about Canada's involvement within NATO and how it values strength and cohesion within that alliance in the defense of those particular values in Europe.
But Alexander, there is the argument that is made that Canada's influence as a middle power flowed to a significant extent during the Cold War from being seen as an honest broker or a helpful fixer in international conflicts. Canada has very clearly landed on one side of the Ukrainian conflict. So has that not helped to undermine Canada's reputation? I mean, is this not coincident? Is this not a coincidence that indeed such a foreign policy that has abandoned this honest broker type position has occurred at the same time as we have, for example, lost 2 consecutive bids for a UN Security Council seat, as we've become increasingly dependent on the United States and the liberal norms that it promotes? Do you see any connection there? And is this not deleterious for Canadian interests?
Perhaps, but I think that particular image of Canadian foreign policy is wildly overstated. I mean, we are part of NATO, and during the Cold War itself, we had tens of thousands of Canadian soldiers. In fact, we had access to nuclear weapons in the event of a contingency. So we were far from neutral in that particular crisis. And indeed, we were probably at the peak of our influence back then. So the argument could be spun the other way around, that perhaps if we weren't so if we weren't equivocating so much, perhaps we would actually have some of that influence regained. Because you can argue that Canada's global influence was actually much stronger when it pitched itself more firmly in one side rather than try to hedge its bets.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Anatol, over to you to provide a final response to what everyone else has said, and also to give some parting thoughts to the Canadian audience. Besides forming an alliance with China, what else can we possibly do in terms of our policy options?
Thank you, and I'm very sorry I have to leave. Just a couple of things to end with. I mean, first of all, the problems of democracy, or at least of liberal democracy in Eastern Europe, have nothing to do with Russia or Russian pressure. Poland is not responsive to Russian pressure, to put it mildly. This is very much due to the internal problems and the political culture of these countries. Now, that applies to Ukraine with knobs on, when it comes to the problems of liberal democracy. Secondly, I have to say, I think that the argument that Ukraine is somehow a stepping stone to Russian pressure on other countries is completely mistaken. If you look at Ukrainian-Russian history, if you look at the historical, cultural, economic, strategic importance of Ukraine to Russia, it should be entirely obvious that Ukraine is the issue for Russia in itself. This does not indicate that the next step will be some form of additional pressure on NATO. Solve the Ukrainian problem, and I believe that you have to a great extent solved the issue of the West's relations with Russia. By the way, I mean, that does not mean simply surrendering to Russia's demands, and demilitarization of the Donbass is essential. But it does mean, I think, going far further in seeking a compromise than the USA has yet done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us, Anatol. For the rest of our audience, please stick with us for the next 15 minutes as we're going to unpack Canada's interests a little bit more in this conflict. But first, we have a couple of questions from the audience, and we've got 2 former soldiers among us here. So I'd like to direct one question to each of you. To Yulia, we have a question from Margaret Huber, who asks, how can Canada help Ukraine deal with the sort of massive cyber attacks that they have been suffering in recent weeks? And a question for Paul, which is, how do you think that the existence of NATO Navy forces in time-limited periods in the Black Sea will influence or affect the conflict in Ukraine and NATO's relationship with Russia as well? So Yulia first, and then Paul.
Thank you for this question. So I think it's important for Canada to continue cooperating with Ukraine on a number of issues. And as far as the cyber attack is concerned, we can see that even by doing so, well, it is likely that Russia is behind this attack and that they're trying to divide the West. So first and foremost, I think that the Western countries, NATO and Canada, should stand as united front against Russia and Russian aggression, and if possible also provide resources and share knowledge on how Ukraine can counter future aggressive acts. If you talk about some of the more long-term goals, I think that it's important for Canada to raise civic interest and also public understanding of the national security matters, and also develop its own strategy on how to counter Russia's malignant influences that affect Canada's national and strategic interests. And also continuing to support security service reform, gender support and awareness initiatives, democracy building projects in Ukraine. I have had a great privilege to attend a gender curriculum development conference in Ukraine organized by Canada and the Canadian Armed Forces. And I was amazed by the amount of resources that have been developed in very short period of time, and about the grand amount of knowledge that Canada is sharing with Ukraine and Ukrainian security structures that is helping empower not only women in Ukraine, but also empower the society in many ways, and helping spread those liberal democratic values of openness, democracy, and cooperation are extremely important.
Thanks very much, Julia. And Paul, over to you.
Yeah, you might want to ask Alexander a bit about this too, because I believe he wrote a piece with Mark Gagliotti on the Black Sea, which I have to say I wasn't not a huge fan of. For reasons I could talk about.
I know you weren't.
I think talk of the Black Sea becoming a Russian lake, the type of exaggerated talk we need to rid ourselves of. But NATO can't really do much to affect the balance of naval power in the Black Sea, because the Treaty of Montreux limits how many naval forces can come into the Black Sea at any one point. So these sort of sailings of American and British ships into the Black Sea do not do anything to alter the balance of naval power. All they actually do is piss off the Russians, if we're being quite honest about it. Now, the thing is here is it's about signaling, and this is problems. Signaling is problematic, and it's been well analyzed by international relations academics from sort of Robert Jervis onwards, right? Is the problem is that you take measures such as sending ships to the Black Sea, and you think by doing so you're sending a certain signal, like deterrence or something, right? But the problem is these signals are inevitably, well, not inevitably, but they're very often misinterpreted. So you think you're sending one signal, but the signal which is received is something completely different. So you think you are deterring, but the other side thinks you're aggressing, right? Or coercing. Now, in the case of the Russians, that's pretty much how they view it. Okay, they don't think they're being deterred. They think they are being coerced. And the Russians are not the kind of people who respond very well to coercion, particularly now as they feel much more, confident in their military strength. And the response to this kind of thing, therefore, is to essentially encourage them to believe that they need to do more to increase their own defenses. So in the Black Sea, more NATO incursions into the Black Sea mean that the military-industrial complex lobby of the Russian Navy increases in power, essentially. And so you end up in a typical security dilemma problem, where measures you take as you see it for your own defense are interpreted as aggressive by the other side, which then takes measures as it sees it for its defense, making you worse off than you were before. Now, this is like international relations 101 second class, pretty much. It's like the kind of thing your IR student learns right from the beginning. It's really basic. It's not rocket science, but it's reality, right? So I don't think these sort of NATO maneuvers are at all helpful. They just raise tensions, but they can't actually alter the balance of power. But what they do is they strengthen the arm of the strength. They strengthen the military-industrial complex within the Russian state, and that's counterproductive from our point of view.
Very interesting to see that we've had two very different perspectives on this panel so far. There's been one in which one perspective has very much articulated the notion that Russia feels as if it is weak, and that therefore it needs to act vis-a-vis Ukraine out of its position of weakness. And yet there's the other perspective that, Paul, you touched on just now, which has to do with Russia being increasingly confident about its military strength. And that's certainly a view that during my time in Moscow, I found to be very much present as well. That the Russians believe that history is effectively on their side. It's only a matter of time. And so Canada's policy response, I guess, depends to a significant extent on how we actually think about the sources of Russian conduct. And it seems as if there remain significant divisions in the policy community on this question, even today. Alexander, over to you with my next question, which is in terms of the balance between the need to promote certain norms and principles and send important signals, signals of deterrence, if you can call them that, vis-a-vis Russia. All of that on the one hand. And on the other hand, the need to ensure that there is stability and dialogue and a degree of inclusiveness in Europe so that the most powerful country in the European security system, which is Russia, does not feel entirely excluded from the core of the security architecture of its own region. Where is the balance to be found between these two things, and how can Canada help to strike it?
I think NATO has actually found that balance to some extent already. Look at the enhanced forward presence. It's specifically designed to take into account the parameters of the NATO-Russia Founding Act. After all, these are battle groups stationed in 4 countries, the 3 Baltic countries and Poland. They amount to more or less 1,000 military personnel each. They're multinational. Of course, the Canadian one in Latvia is the most multinational, basically representing a third of NATO. And they're sufficiently sized so that they provide some degree of assurance to those host countries, but also to signal that these are not forces capable of mounting offensive operations. And indeed, NATO has been very insistent on the adherence to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, even though one can argue quite persuasively, I might add, that the conditions under which that Founding Act was written have dramatically changed with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But that's because there are members within the alliance that, of course, insist on the Founding Act being respected. So I think in a way, the way that NATO has gone about trying to reassure its allies has been exactly to thread the needle, as it were, between assurance of the Baltic countries, but also of Russia itself, right? Because to deter, you also need to think about assurance. And I think NATO has actually done rather well there. And indeed, official NATO policy has been an inclination to do dialogue, or at least to have it open. That's why we saw the discussions this past week. And that's consistent with NATO policy. So I believe that the measures taken by NATO have been, or NATO members have largely been proportional, if not even less than proportional, because again, if you look at the Black Sea, the military balance there has been completely upended, considering the military buildup that we've seen in Ukraine. This is not me, this is the Center of Naval Analysis, saying by the likes of Michael Kaufman and others, emphasizing that Russia has put in place a suite of defensive and offensive capabilities on that peninsula. If sailing the HMS Defender has that sort of impact, then wow, that's quite astonishing. I didn't know the Defender was that powerful. But I think that's just to signal reassurance to Ukraine, to show the flag, to uphold freedoms of navigation in those particular waterways. And so I think the response actually has been proportionate. I don't think it's necessarily a security dilemma as such, but that's an academic conversation we can have elsewhere.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very useful. Yulia, over to you now. Russia is present not just in the Euro-Atlantic theater, but also in the Arctic and as well in the Asia-Pacific theater. And Canada abuts geographically all 3 of those theaters. So yes, Canada has an interest in showing strong support for Ukraine, but at the same time, does a very hawkish and assertive Canadian foreign policy on the question of Russia in Europe, does that not risk spilling over into the Arctic, for example, and engulfing that strategic region, and therefore making Canada's own security environment in the Arctic less favorable, less cooperative?
Up to date, to a certain extent, the security dilemma of the Arctic and Eastern Europe have been kept relatively separate, I would say, both by Canada and Russia. But on the other hand, I would like to reiterate that empowering Russia on the Eastern Front only gives it more power and pretext to behave more aggressively in the Arctic potentially. But so far, I'm I would say I'm relatively calm with Russia's actions in the Arctic, especially in regards to Canada. But on the other hand, I'd like to once again reiterate that legitimization of Russia's malignant activities and acceptance of its narratives only empowers it. And we know that Canada also has some strategic interests in the Asia, Indo-Pacific, and the signals that the West is sending to Russia will also be it will be heard by other countries, in particular China, and also by other Canada's partners in the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. And it's important for them to hear that their appropriate responses are being conducted. And I would also like to mention a couple other facts. We know that Russian submarines are threatening to disrupt undersea internet cables, that the UK has been reporting that Russians have recently also chosen to neither confirm nor deny the possibility of military deployments to Cuba and Venezuela. Russians are involved in Mali and Central African republics, which conflicts with France's interest. And once again, the whole issue of Germany, France, and Russia relationship is very interesting. We can talk about it further, I suppose, if there's interest in that. There was interference into US elections, Brexit, disinformation, cyber warfare, support to far-right movements in Europe. So Russia's actions certainly do not end on Eastern Europe, and they have significant global impact, unfortunately.
Okay, we have time just for one last question, which I'm going to pose to both Paul and Alexander to wrap up, which is I hope you can help our audience to get a better sense of the bigger picture of Canadian foreign policy and Canada's international strategy. What seems to be in the news the most these days as it relates to Canadian foreign policy specifically is the forthcoming Indo-Pacific strategy. Obviously, Canada-China relations have been very troubled for the past several years, with no end to that a negative turn in the diplomatic relationship foreseen anytime soon. So Paul and Alexander, what should Canada be doing in the European context in order to facilitate a pivot towards the Asian region and to devote more of Canadian resources towards the Asian region, if that is indeed where Canada's focus needs to be lying over the longer term? Does this continued NATO-centric foreign policy that Canada continues to practice now for decades, is that an asset? Is that a detriment in terms of our ability to pivot to the Pacific? And what sort of approach should we be taking in Europe in order to increase our credibility and our influence in Asia? Do we need a more assertive approach in Europe, or rather do we need to seek a more of an accommodation in Europe in order to create the space necessary for us to be able to devote our attention more to the Pacific theater? Paul, and then Alexander with the last word.
I have a rather cynical view of Canadian foreign policy, which is that we don't do strategy and never have done strategy, and are not capable of doing strategy for the simple reason that there is no point having a strategy when that strategy can be derailed at any moment by what our neighbors to the south choose to do. We could have the best China strategy in the world, but then if America changes direction under a new leadership, our China strategy won't be worth the scrap of paper it's written on. We have tactics. We react to individual things, and insofar as we have a strategy, it's one of followership, you might say. I do think we are capable of being more independent than we are at the moment. We were certainly under the leadership of Jean Chrétien, not always positively, but nevertheless, we staked out some unique positions on a number of issues. Recently, I'm afraid I've seen Canada involved in, I think, a number of ill thought out initiatives, such as what Canada, its leadership in the Lima group, which is attempting to topple Maduro in Venezuela, has been a total failure, and I can't see what we've got out of it at all. As you mentioned, our failure to get UN seats is indicative of problems there. But on the whole, I don't think there's much. I don't have a very good answer, because I don't think there's much we really can do, because our power is extremely limited. I don't think we're really capable of strategic action. The most we can do is try and nudge allies in a certain direction. But at the moment, I'm not sure we're doing that in a very productive way.
Alexander, we've got 1 minute left, so the last word to you on this point.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and in some ways, I agree with Paul. As a matter of fact, I think there is an issue in terms of formulating strategy in this country. But I also think that most people in most countries feel the same way about their own leadership, regardless as to where they are. But that being said, I'm not sure what the U.S. preference is there for Canada to do, because on the one hand, you might think that you might want to see Canada be more assertive in the Indo-Pacific, because after all, it wants to build a coalition to contain, as it were, China. But at the same time, it likes Canada and Europe for the simple reason that it contributes to burden sharing. And so Canada might just have more to contribute there. So I don't know. I don't think we do policy just because of the United States. I think, the United States is probably, it doesn't really think about us that much anyway. That gives us some bandwidth. And even so, if you look at US preferences, it's actually not even clear where they even lean. So that gives us some flexibility. But I agree that Ottawa tends to be very comfortable in terms of thinking about its place within the transatlantic community, more so in the Indo-Pacific one, even though we are a Pacific state. I just don't see much in the way of that pivot. And as such, I don't see it coming to the detriment of anything that we're doing in Europe, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for helping us unpack this multifaceted and very complex topic. And thank you, of course, to the NATO Association of Canada for co-sponsoring today's timely panel discussion with us. If you'd like to learn more about our organization, the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, please visit peacediplomacy.org, where you'll also find an excellent article written by Paul Robinson as our IPD Senior Fellow on this issue that we've discussed today. Thanks again for joining us. Merci beaucoup, and we hope to welcome you again sometime soon.
Thank you very much for the terrific